Welcome to Lecture 1 in History of Terrorism. Today I want to introduce you to the subject of the history of terrorism by examining what terrorism is. On the surface, this seems an easy question to answer. What is terrorism? Looking at the root of the word terrorism, in the dictionary there comes the idea that the word terrorism comes into English from French terror, from Latin terrorem, terror, or a great fear, a dread, from the verb terrere, which is to fill with fear or to frighten. Thus, terrorism has built into its very germane meaning fear, fright, or dread. The first use of the word terrorism comes from the 18th century French Revolution, when the word terrorism was used in 1798 to describe the activity of the French state in employing physical violence to control the subject population. At the root of our understanding of terrorism, then, is fear. Terrorism is an act that causes fear. But of course, not everything that causes fear can be called terrorism. This would be absurd. It would mean that parents are terrorists, teachers are terrorists, and the person who nearly hits you in your car and causes your heart to race could also be called a terrorist. And we know this is not true. In order to label something terrorism, or someone a terrorist, we instead have to look at the historical context of actions and deeds that have been labeled as such. This leads us to the problem of perception. At the root of this perception is one's own view of the world. Are there, for example, certain shared universal values or truths by which we can judge something to be an act of terrorism, or do we have to look at each case individually, at each act and each actor, in isolation given their historical context? Let's look at each of these problems in turn. If we assume that murder is universally wrong, and this is a dubious assumption, as we know intuitively from our own experiences. For example, if you kill someone who's attempting to do harm to you, this is murder. We might call it self-defense, but it's murder. Yet we find it morally justifiable in the light of your own life being possibly violated. So murder is not necessarily a universally abhorrent human activity. We have to bear that in mind. So if we return to the assumption, say, that murder, though, is universally wrong, and a terrorist act, such as the recent bombing of the Boston Marathon, which causes a loss of life, then we can see that one of the kernels of terrorism is murder. But what kind of murder? Well, in the case of the Boston Marathon again, it's murder for the sake of political gain. Well, what kind of political gain? If we believe that the bombers were motivated by ideology, fighting in what we call the global jihad, then we have another element that helps us refine our view of terrorism. Let's just define ideology as a deeply held political or religious belief that motivates one to act. Crudely stated, then, terrorists are motivated by ideology to act in violent ways that induce fear, that is, terror, in their target population. How does this work in practice? Well, the 4th century BC Chinese philosopher Mencius already looked at political violence when he said, quote, "When one by force subdues men, they do not submit to him in heart. They submit because their strength is not adequate to resist." Here we have an early expression of the role of violence in compelling people politically. To force people, in other words, against their will to do something they would not do in the absence of the threat of force. Let's move on to a further general discussion of what terrorism is, who are some terrorists today, and what are some of the legal issues and responses relating to terrorism. How many terrorist groups can you name? From the American perception, there are dozens, if not hundreds of such groups. Names that spring to mind obviously include groups like Al-Qaeda, or Hamas, or the Red Brigades, or the Peruvian communist group, the Shining Path, which you've probably never heard of. But what about criminal gangs like Mara Salvatrucha, otherwise known as MS-13, or the so-called narco-terrorists fighting the governments of Colombia and Mexico? What about a group like the Irish Republican Army, which to many Irish people is simply a guerrilla army fighting against colonial rule? Let's take a step back and look at what I'll label fundamental values and terrorism. Can we perceive some basic shared human values, such as the case of murder that I mentioned above, that in fact seem to unify human nature in some way, shape, or form? I think we can. Most societies, both pre-industrial and modern, have a number of proscribed social behaviors and prescribed behaviors. These behaviors that are proscribed are at base wrong because they undermine the group's prospects of survival. For example, murder, rape, incest, kidnapping, treason, or rebellion, which are considered morally wrong in most societies. Prescribed behaviors are positive actions, which help bind the society together and help it physically survive, like marriage, hunting, growing food, working, or having children. These are encouraged by society because they're germane to its survival. So I mention these because it helps us, I think, establish some kind of fundamental agreement of a shared humanity, and perhaps even, although this is more dubious, a shared morality from which we can argue the right or wrong of terrorism and better help to classify it. So let's look briefly at the nature of terrorism. Terrorism can therefore be expressed generally as a proscribed act, counter to the values expressed by most every human society and social group. This is unsatisfactory, of course, but let's use it for now. So who articulates and conducts terrorist acts? Terrorism, obviously, in this context, then, if you take this assumption of proscribed acts as being immoral, terrorism then becomes both illegal and immoral. So who articulates and conducts terrorist acts? Well, obviously terrorists do. But that takes us back to our original question. Who is a terrorist? What is terrorism? Are there rules of terrorism? There certainly are. Terrorists articulate a strategy. They carefully define the limits of their actions. And they also express boundaries in the way they expect to be treated. This is very clear, for example, in the so-called global war on terror from the Islamist side, where there are very strict rules of engagement set out by terrorists regarding their selection of target, what's a legitimate target, and so on. There are obviously problems of perspective, which I again raise. Guerrilla fighters in the Afghan war of the Soviets in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, the so-called mujahideen, we call them freedom fighters in the United States, but they committed acts defined by the international community as war crimes or terrorism. Let's then look at some definitions and see if we can get a little bit better clarity about what terrorism is, or at least how people have attempted to articulate it in definition today. The use and or threat of repeated violence in support of or in opposition to some authority where violence is employed to induce the fear of similar attack and as many non-immediate victims as possible, so that those so threatened accept and comply with the demands of the terrorist. Now, let's take a closer look at this and try and understand what's being said here. First, under this definition, notice that violence does not have to be done in order for there to be terrorism. The threat of violence is considered equally important. In other words, let's take the example of a state that continually threatens its citizens by random arrests and torture. The actual acts of violence may be quite small in number, but the possibility that you, as a citizen, could be incarcerated or disappeared or jailed shapes your behavior. A citizen of such a state lives in perpetual fear and bows to the commands of the government, even though, again, the proportion of people who are acted upon directly are quite small. Secondly, notice that the idea is that fear here is a multiplier. It allows the terrorist to shape the behavior by directly threatening or harming the few, the so-called non-immediate victims, in other words, or the audience of the terrorist act, are really those whose behavior is being shaped by the terrorist. Move on to the FBI's definition, which is the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. Let's look at a couple of points here. The word unlawful appears, and this is unsurprising since the FBI is a law enforcement agency working within the framework of the law and U.S. legal understandings of what is unlawful and what is lawful. Likewise, government here is capitalized because it has a distinct legal definition. Finally, note the stress on the civilian population. This again underscores the role of the FBI as pursuing and ultimately helping to legally prosecute terrorists. But this begs the question, what is a civilian? And does this mean that terrorism cannot occur against military personnel, for example? Also notice that it's the use of force or violence against persons or property. So it could be, say, blowing up a warehouse. That could be considered an act of terror, even though there's no loss of human life. It, in fact, does spread fear among a target population. But let's go back to that first question I asked about civilians versus military. I mean, what is a civilian? Well, regarding the first question, we can say that civilians are non-combatants, non-uniformed, unarmed people, perhaps. Is a person working in a government bomb factory then a civilian? I mean, by some accounts, yes. But in the view of some, no. Notoriously, this is one of the legal props that Osama bin Laden used in justifying his attacks against Americans of any stripe. There were no civilians, according to bin Laden. Why? Well, bin Laden declared that America, being a democracy, had its citizens shape its government. Its citizens were therefore responsible for the actions of its government. Therefore, every one of its citizens were morally culpable for the actions of the U.S. state. Ultimately, this guilt, from bin Laden's perspective, made it right and legal to kill any American, regardless of age, sex, or official status, because they were morally guilty for the acts of its democratically elected government. This is an inversion of the idea of limited moral culpability, and one of the ways in which bin Laden altered the face of Islamist terrorism. And let's put this in another way. So, in bin Laden's view, for example, there are no civilians because perhaps you or your parents voted for George Bush, and George Bush conducted war against Islam, for example, and you share in Bush's actions, and you are morally culpable for the actions of, say, the Iraq War. This is a great stretch, and it was a sort of great legal leap for bin Laden to make, but it was revolutionary in the way Islamists approached their perception of the United States and conduct of terrorist operations. Move on to another definition, this by the academician C.J.M. Drake, who states, terrorism is defined here by the recurrent use of or threatened use of politically motivated and clandestinely organized violence by a group whose aim is to influence a psychological target in order to make it behave in a way which the group desires. Notice a couple of key differences here between Drake's definition and those we've just looked at. Well, there's no mention of legality or illegality. There's a stress on the habitual use or threat of violence. There's also the issue of psychology and of political motivation. But what about other ideological motivations? I mean, the definition is problematic because it fails to address things like narco-terrorism, which is about financial gain, or religious violence, which is about faith, unless we assume all these actions are political in the end, and we might do so, in fact. Notice finally the notion of secrecy, and this is important. Drake talks about clandestine organization. So often terrorists plan their activities away from public view, and so their actions seem surprising or almost even random to us. But what about a state like North Korea, which is not clandestine in any way? It openly threatens nuclear war, including against the United States, and it openly imprisons and persecutes its people through forced labor and mass incarceration. So clandestine doesn't really define state terror conducted in this way. This leads me to the important point that many students often raise when they attempt to characterize and define terrorism. That is, its random nature. Terrorism is only random, though, in the sense that it is random to its victims and the intended audience who witnesses the act and are subsequently placed in a state of fear. Now follow me. Let's return to the Boston Marathon bombings, which is the freshest example. The act, at the time, when it's broadcast in chaos on the news, seemed senseless and random, the mass killing and maiming of people at a sporting event. But to the terrorists, the targets were carefully selected. Research was done, planning was done, bombs were made, and the timing of the attack was specific, not random at all. Therefore, I think these ideas of secrecy and randomness are not really very helpful in understanding how to define or characterize terrorism. Let's move on to Walter Laqueur, another academic expert on terrorism, who states, quite briefly, terrorism constitutes the illegitimate use of force to achieve a political objective when innocent people are targeted. And of course, this has the problems of, well, what is legitimate? Obviously, Laqueur has in mind here the notion of a state with a legal framework that declares any kind of illegal activity, like we saw in the FBI definition, as being illegitimate. And it shares, though, three characteristics that some of our other definitions have looked at. The use of force, although here again, not the threat of the use of force, but the actual use of force. Politics, that is a political objective, and the innocence of the victims, which we just have seen may be difficult to define what innocence means. Let's look at a more official definition. This is from the U.S. Department of State, which states terrorism is, quote, the calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to inculcate fear, intended to coerce or intimidate governments or societies in the pursuit of goals that are generally political, religious, or ideological, unquote. Now, you can see that this definition by the U.S. State Department separates politics, religion, and ideology, even though we've just discussed how this is difficult, maybe impossible. Aristotle, for example, noted that man is a political animal, and the word politics comes from the Greek word polis, which is often translated as city, so politics being the things that have to do with the city. But in fact, we could understand it more broadly as simply community. So politics, therefore, is anything in the public life of a community. Thus, everything conducted in the public forum is political. That is, whether it's religious or ideological or even economic in many ways, this can be seen as an extension of politics. So the U.S. State Department definition doesn't really help us much in any way. It does have the common threads, though, of the use of violence, so the actual act of violence, or the threat of violence that we saw earlier. But it adds to this the intention of coercion, intimidation, which implies a desired outcome on behalf of the terrorists who are motivated by politics, religion, or other undefined ideology, which, again, what that last sentence statement means, what other ideologies are we talking about here? Greed, in the case of, say, narco-terrorism, or the Somali pirates, where financial gain seems to be the only ideological motivator? That's unclear. And finally, I will end this brief introduction with a popular saying or maxim. which is one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And you've all heard this, I'm sure. This maxim is unassailably true. I mean, witness the U.S. efforts, for example, to label some groups fighting in the civil war in Syria as terrorists, while asserting that others, conducting the same kinds of operations in the same war at the same time, are not terrorists. I mentioned the old case above of the Irish Republican Army, particularly during the early 20th century, when Southern Ireland broke free of British rule. Were these terrorists or guerrilla revolutionaries fighting against a colonial power the only way they could? Their means included murder, bombing civilians, and similar methods that we've seen above. The problem with saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter is that it doesn't get us very far at all. It removes any moral foundation or framework, legalism or public discourse from the equation and simply reduces the problem of terrorism to one of relativism. This can't work in practice because humans exist, obviously, in a specific historic, moral, and legal framework. So, as trite and as quaint as it is, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter doesn't really help us to understand or define or refine our further definition or our understanding of terrorism. Finally, we'll conclude with some observations. And you may have found this walk through the definition of terrorism to be frustrating. I mean, I do every time I revisit this subject. We could have gone on, by the way, through dozens of examples, each of which has its own specific problems and limitations. But this brief overview has intended to offer a few attempts at defining what we call terrorism. We have not had the time to discuss many broader issues, such as how terrorism differs from conventional or guerrilla war, but how terrorism can in fact occur in such conflicts. We've also been unable to look at international laws or specific national laws, but these would not really help us come up with a satisfactory definition more than the examples I've chosen have, I think. Let's look at some of the characteristics of the examples that I have utilized to characterize terrorism. Among these are its illegal nature, its immoral nature, the use of actual violence, or just threat of violence, the intentions of the terrorist actors, that is, their motivations and hoped for outcomes, whether it's political, social, or religious change, or the secret nature of the planning of the act. We might call that randomness to those who are uninitiated. The public nature, though, of the acts themselves. Terrorism cannot occur without an audience. The real value of a terrorist attack, as far as the perpetrators are concerned, are the after effects, the terror their actions cause within the community they target. Thus, terrorism was called by its early proponents, as we'll discuss later, propaganda by deed. That is, one act which has a ripple effect throughout society. Propaganda by deed. Now, your task is to look up these and further examples, say from the United Nations and elsewhere, and thoughtfully analyze the shortcomings of each as we've done in this brief presentation, and write how you best feel that terrorism can be formally characterized.